Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Greetings from sunny Brussels. It's a pleasure to address you. First, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to speak at this great conference. Today, I want to talk briefly about how threat actors adapt to particular circumstances and how they might deploy technological advances, especially the so-called emerging and disruptive technologies, in the nearest future. So it is a matter of a general consensus that we are entering a chaotic period of an increased technological volatility, rapidly growing complexity of threats, and also on the political level, consequently growing strategic competition. And technology is actually both the cause and the subject of these trends. I would say that there is an important lesson that we can learn when looking at the cybersecurity threats landscape since the start of the coronavirus pandemic. What it shows us is that the threat actors adjust their use of technological tools to take advantage of the current social and political situation, being in this case a global health social crisis. The exploitation of COVID-related vulnerabilities became the chief goal of malicious actors during the last year and a half. And we could see many of the proliferating threats being actually carefully accommodated to mimic real-world developments, like, for example, malware disguised as official communications from a public institutions or a government, or a phishing email relating to a recent decision that was just publicly announced by the authorities just a few hours before. So we could see how phishing and email became the most diffused attack vendors. But we could also see how, since the start of the pandemic, ransomware has become the most widespread threat. It is estimated that the value of average ransom has doubled in 2021 when compared to the previous year. And we can also see the rise of a new business model in cybercrime that is called ransomware as a service, which significantly obscures the law's enforcement situational awareness and undermines attribution. Ransomware as a service relies on phishing and email attacks to target victims, which became so much easier during the pandemic lockdowns. On that note, it is also good to mention that research indicates the rise of another service, namely phishing as a service. We also can observe an increasing use of zero-day exploits by the ransom threat actors, which is particularly worrying. Ransom actors deploy it to extract from organizations data sets that concern their customers, employees, or their users, and then target the users and employees and customers for ransom. 0 days are therefore used to establish presence in targeted network and then further enable ransom attacks. It is also good to remember that it was a ransomware attack that was connected to a death of a hospital patient last year in Düsseldorf, which was the first ever recorded case of a civilian death where a cyber attack was involved. And I think that it is very telling that over the last months, the most targeted sectors were public administration and government, digital service providers, and healthcare. We have also seen an increased number of attacks on supply chains, which we should regard in the context of the global supply chain crisis that began in 2020 over the course of the pandemic. Not to mention the global massive wave of COVID-related disinformation that has already been nicknamed an infodemic, and rightly so. It is indeed very telling to the fact that threat actors learned not only to use technology or thoughts of human nature to pursue their aims, but also they have learned to immediately take advantage of the social situation with the speed of action and agility of intelligence services. Let's start for a moment as a simple experiment. Let's not think about this as solely cyber attacks confined to the field of cybersecurity. Let's try to see them as highly sophisticated attempts at exploitation of the social crisis, empowered by advanced technologies that are also damaging to the social order. One thing it tells us about the future of threats and threat actors is that they will exploit to their end whatever major or minor crisis comes next. It might be the next financial crisis, it might be the next health crisis, an environmental crisis, migrant crisis, or really any other form of social disruption or breakdown, for instance, caused by a deployment of a hybrid warfare, like the one we can see this week at the Eastern EU border. As bad as these developments might be in themselves, they will be weaponized by threat actors, and the actors will use the technologies as key enablers to their operations. And this brings us to the topic of the emerging and disruptive technologies. So often we can hear that the EDTs are kind of general purpose technologies in the sense that their development brings game-changing effects to almost every political, security, economic, social sector. This is at least true for technologies like AI, biotechnology, or big data analytics. We generally assume that progress in these technologies will lead us to transformation of how we work, defend our societies, undergo medical treatment, etc. But first, we have to remember that with the maturity of the EDTs, it is extremely hard to foresee how a specific technology might be used by a threat actor. Most EDTs are usually ascribed to the technology readiness levels from 1 to 5 or 6, depending on specific applications. At least in some of the EDTs, what we can imagine that the technology will do is very far from what it actually does. Take AI as an example. There is a growing suspicion that the amount of hype that surrounds AI is exaggerated. For example, in defense, we are not yet witnessing the rise of a fully autonomous lethal systems with independent decision-making that can stand a confrontation with a team of human adversaries. This is because AI fails when confronted with real-world complexities. Sometimes we as humans and operators are trying to come up with artificial solutions to help AI and cover for those failures, like building driving environments dedicated solely for the movement of autonomous vehicles, which are in themselves very far from the real-world driving conditions. Also, AI is not doing very well in predictions. It is not able to predict a terrorist attack, or it's not able to predict how a military adversary will behave in a conflict situation. It is entirely safe to assume that AI will actually not deliver in the next decade on many of the breakthroughs that we expect it to bring. Nevertheless, it would be a folly to dismiss AI. In the perspective of the next 10 to 20 years, we can assume that AI will provide as a hugely disruptive factor, especially in big data, computation, cybersecurity, health, and education. Over the last years, there have been significant progress in learning, perception, and reasoning capabilities of AI. AI genuinely exists when applied to do narrow, very specific, repeatable tasks that are based on well-defined and stable rules. Those can have multiple applications that, when mature, are able to overtake human performance and make some actions so much more efficient. When applied to cyber defense systems, it can significantly enhance threat detection capabilities and boost decision-making in human AI teams. We can assume that there will be a rise in development of AI agents for both defensive and offensive cyber capabilities. AI will alter our relationship with threats, be they in physical or cyber domain. First of all, AI will introduce new types of threats. Algorithmic computation will, for instance, allow to penetrate new environments, which was previously impossible to maneuver for human operators. Deepfakes and agile generation of fake media are another example of how AI will push forward the weaponization of information, which can be not only applied into the public infosphere, but also, for example, in relation to information flowing in corporate or government networks. Then AI will also scale up the existing types of threats. AI is, in its essence, a technology that is scalable. In that sense, AI further enhances the asymmetric character of cyber weapons. lowering the levels of entry and allowing a single perpetrator to attack an entire geographically dispersed group of targets, both in cyber and physical. And then artificial intelligence can also transform or empower the threats we already know. Cyber attacks are already becoming more efficient and more disguised. Detection and attribution is harder, and hence the attacker has greater chances of success. The greatest challenge related to the EDTs is the unknown. It is genuinely hard to foresee how these technologies will actually be weaponized, or how combinations of these technologies will be leveraged to pursue threat actors' aims. For example, artificial intelligence and big data analytics, when combined together, will mutually augment each other and create new capabilities that might be groundbreaking in the context of a crisis of tomorrow. At the same time, though, these capabilities might also be used for malicious or offensive purposes. Therefore, it is impossible to ignore them and wait for the adversaries to take advantage. That's why I would like to encourage you all to look at the EDTs with two lenses. One would be a lens of skepticism that would be fueled by increased and science-proved knowledge on what the technologies actually can do and in which fields then actually they will deliver in the foreseeable future, as opposed to a lot of hype that we can observe nowadays. The second lens, though, would be to understand that it is hugely important to cooperate and invest in the development of those technologies. Cooperation is particularly important, since those technologies usually require a lot of capital, scientific and industrial base, and a lot of effort to develop. It is one thing to develop an algorithm, then to elevate it to a level of an application to a weapon system, for instance, then manufacture those weapon systems and deploy them to vehicles in the possession of the armed forces, and then to change the doctrine of those armed forces so it actually acknowledges a new kind of equipment that has been supplemented. So the more we cooperate between member states of the European Union, between like-minded countries globally, between the public and the private sector, the greater we have a chance to actually harness the advantage of emerging and disruptive technologies, whatever it will be. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rekowski, for your nice speech.